Okay, let's unpack this. We have a deeply unsettling case today, centered on a moment of shared delusion, captured, shockingly, on film, that escalated into an inexplicable, fatal act of violence.
It's a story that really forces us to question the boundaries of, well, of criminal intent, mental illness, and ultimately systemic failure.
Indeed. We're going to move beyond the sensational headlines that many of you might remember to conduct a meticulous deep dive into the 2008 incidents involving the Swedish identical twins, Ursula and Sabina Eriksson.
And the core phenomenon we have to analyze here is known technically as folie deux, or shared psychosis. It's a condition as rare as it is terrifying.
Our source material for this provides a really comprehensive summary of this grim timeline. It's a journey that moves from initial, erratic behavior in public through absolute chaos on the UK's M6 motorway, and then
finally, to the random, tragic murder of an innocent man.
the material includes crucial psychiatric assessments, which are just essential for understanding the court's ultimate decision.
And critically, it also includes commentary from the victim's family. And that really grounds the whole tragedy in a discussion about accountability and systemic failure, not just individual pathology.
Our mission for you, the listener, is to trace the precise sequence of these events, from their strange behavior on a coach bus to the harrowing televised scenes on the M6 and the ultimate tragedy involving Glenn Hollinshead.
And we really need to focus on the medical and legal explanations offered for the sudden descent to delusion.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Especially addressing that baffling central question. Why was Sabina released from custody, free to commit a fatal crime, just hours after her shocking, violent public breakdown?
What's fascinating here from an analytical standpoint is the sheer speed with which a previously unmanifested rare psychiatric disorder can just erupt into public view and create such catastrophic destruction.
It really challenges our assumptions about criminal intent.
It does. And about the capacity for assessment in those immediate post-crisis situations and, standard risk protocols, we must pay very close attention to the legal conclusion. The finding of manslaughter with diminished responsibility, as it legally defines the official context for this tragedy and how the system tried to rationalize what seems like completely irrational violence.
Let's start by establishing the lives of the sisters before this shocking timeline begins in 2008. The contrast between their stable past and their sudden collapse it's vital.
It really is. Ursula and Sabina Eriksson were identical twins born in Sund, Värmland, Sweden on November 3rd, 1967. They had a conventional upbringing, an older sister, an older brother, just a normal family.
And based on the records, in their youth and through adulthood, there was no documented history of significant mental health issues.
None at all. No psychiatric interventions, and crucially, no criminal convictions for either woman.
Yeah.
They appeared to have typical, functional lives established across continents.
And that's the first really surprising fact here.
It is, because folie deux doesn't necessarily require a prior psychiatric history in the secondary patient, and sometimes not even in the primary one, though there might be underlying vulnerabilities.
That distinction is incredibly important. It means the onset of this shared delusion was acute and rapid.
Exactly. By the year 2000, their lives had separated geographically. They're not completely. Ursula was living in the United States, in Bellevue, Washington,
While Sabina was settled across the Atlantic in Mallow, County Cork, Ireland, living with her spouse and her 2 children.
And the disastrous chain of events begins on Friday, May 16th, 2008. Ursula travels to Ireland to visit Sabina.
And the sources note that for unclear reasons, and critically, in secret, the sisters departed Sabina's home shortly after Ursula arrived.
That secrecy right there, that suggests a state of mind that was already highly agitated.
Maybe paranoid.
Yes, paranoid, and certainly driven by some overwhelming internal impetus. They left without telling family, without taking normal precautions. They likely traveled by ferry, arriving in Liverpool, England at 8:30 in the morning on Saturday, May 17th.
Their first official interaction with authorities on British soil it's highly significant.
Yeah.
It tells us that whatever delusion was taking hold, it already involved a sense of persecution or danger.
Because they went directly to St. Anne Street Police Station in Liverpool.
Right. Ostensibly, they were reporting urgent concerns over the safety of Sabina's children back in Ireland.
But the police, after contacting Dublin authorities to follow up, they learned a crucial piece of context.
Which was that Sabina had fought with her partner the previous night.
Exactly. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, the secret departure, and the immediate police report about the children, It all suggests an intense state of agitation or a perceived, probably exaggerated threat was already driving their actions before they even left Ireland.
This initial instability is a key marker then.
It is. A domestic dispute may have acted as the psychological trigger, causing the primary sufferer, who was likely Ursula, to manifest delusions that Sabina, the secondary sufferer, then adopted and shared.
But the fact that the police visit resulted in no action.
Well, that reinforces the idea that their distress, while present, had not yet tipped over into outright dangerous behavior. They were strange, but not, detainable.
So following this brief interaction, around 11:30 that same Saturday morning, the pair boarded a National Express coach in Liverpool. They were bound for London.
Ostensibly trying to move on, but their journey was very short-lived.
Yes, a police report stated the sisters suddenly disembarked at Kiel Services, a motorway service station off the M6, claiming they weren't feeling well.
But the coach driver's account reveals something much more critical. He had already become suspicious of their erratic behavior, noting their nervousness and odd interactions.
This is why he left them at Kiel Services around 1 in the afternoon. Even though it wasn't a scheduled rest stop, he wanted them off the bus.
He did. And the crucial early behavioral red flag concerned their luggage. The driver noted the twins were clinging tightly to their bags.
A classic sign of intense possessiveness or delusion over perceived vital objects.
Absolutely. And they refused to let him search the bags for illegal items. This refusal was the final straw, leading him to bar them from getting back on the coach.
And this suspicion was shared by the management at the service station?
Yes. The service station manager was informed and also noted their extremely suspicious demeanor, their odd, synchronous movements, and their intense fixation on their bags.
Which prompted her to call the police again.
So officers arrive, they speak to the women. This is the second police intervention in just a few hours, but they ultimately departed. They concluded, based on their observation, that the women seemed harmless.
That moment, where their extreme agitation was noted, investigated, but dismissed, becomes the first critical systemic context for the tragedy that's about to follow.
I mean, the threshold for mandatory mental health detention in the UK, even after noted agitation like that, is very, very high.
So they were actively investigated, noted as erratic, and yet released. It seems the police assessed them as odd, maybe mildly distressed, but failed to recognize the deep, underlying psychotic state that was rapidly escalating.
And that failure to invoke mental health detention powers after repeated public disturbances, it really set the stage for the chaos that followed.
The failure to detain them after the Kiel Services incident leads us directly into the astonishing, terrifying, and ultimately well-documented scene that unfolded moments later on the M6 motorway.
After being abandoned at Kiel Services, the pair departed on foot and chose perhaps the most dangerous place possible to walk.
The central reservation of the busy M6 motorway, one of the UK's primary arteries.
And their actions escalated immediately from just hazardous to suicidal. They attempted to cross the busy motorway for the first time.
And Sabina was struck by a seat Leon. She only had minor injuries from that, but this was not an accidental step. This was a deliberate, impulsive action.
Yes. And Highways Agency officers and the Central Motorway Police Group responded immediately. And crucially, as you mentioned, they were accompanied by a small television crew.
Who just happened to be filming the documentary series Motorway Cops.
And that's why we have the incredibly disturbing, now viral video footage of the entire incident. This footage is pivotal because it provides irrefutable evidence of their delusional state.
What's fascinating here is the sudden, deliberate attempt to run into traffic, moving from merely erratic behavior to profoundly life-threatening action, and the synchronized nature of it all.
Officers were standing with them on the hard shoulder, trying to assess the situation, secure the scene.
And then, without any observable trigger, the profound escalation occurred. Ursula, the suspected primary sufferer, without warning, broke free and ran directly into the side of an oncoming Mercedes-Benz Actros articulated lorry.
A lorry traveling at about 56 miles per hour or 90 kilometers per hour. She suffered devastating, crushing leg injuries and was immediately immobilized.
And this is the key moment that points directly to folie deux. Sabina immediately followed Ursula. She entered the road and was hit head-on by a high-speed Volkswagen Polo.
The synchronization of their suicide attempts suggests the delusion driving one sister immediately commanded the action of the other. It's chilling to watch.
Miraculously, despite being struck by heavy goods vehicles at high speeds, both women survived the impacts. Sabina was unconscious for about 15 minutes, while Ursula lay screaming in pain.
And when paramedics attempted to treat them, their behavior immediately confirmed they were experiencing a profound, active, psychotic break, not just shock or intoxication.
Ursula aggressively resisted aid, screaming, spitting, and telling the restraining officers something chilling and very specific,
She said, "I recognize you. I know you're not real."
which is a textbook manifestation of severe paranoid delusion, specifically misidentification and a belief that reality itself is compromised.
And Sabina, upon regaining consciousness, displayed similar profound paranoia and persecution beliefs. She refused all medical help and shouted, "They're going to steal your organs."
The synchronicity of their delusions, a shared immediate theme of persecution, unreality, and deep mistrust of authority, is a classic hallmark of folie à deux. They were in a shared belief system that dictated their actions.
But the danger wasn't over, even after surviving 2 high-speed collisions. Despite officers attempting to restrain her, Sabina suddenly got to her feet.
In a state of intense confusion, she started screaming for the police, even though officers were literally present, surrounding her, trying to help.
Then she physically struck Officer Tracy Cope in the face before running back into traffic, this time on the opposite side of the motorway.
She was finally physically restrained by emergency workers and members of the public, carried to an ambulance, handcuffed, and eventually sedated.
Given the sheer similarities and the highly dangerous, reckless nature of their actions, police initially suspected a suicide pact or, more commonly, severe drug use, possibly from narcotics like cocaine or amphetamines.
But subsequent medical and forensic investigation found no evidence of any drugs or alcohol in their systems.
And that conclusion eliminated the common explanations and confirmed that the issue was purely psychiatric, a sudden, acute, and explosive mental health crisis, which makes the police's subsequent decision even more difficult to rationalize.
This is where the sequence moves from a documented public health emergency to an inexplicable, fatal systemic failure that cost an innocent man his life.
Ursula was airlifted to the hospital with severe, life-changing injuries. Sabina was also taken to the hospital, but critically showed an apparent lack of concern over her sister's grave condition. She became outwardly calmer.
Here's the failure point. She was discharged and released just 5 hours after being restrained on a major highway.
It just raises the essential and horrifying question that serves as the moral center of this case. How could an individual who had just intentionally run into highway traffic twice, violently resisted police, and exhibited acute paranoid delusions, all of it captured on camera, be deemed fit for release after merely 5 hours of observation?
It speaks to a breakdown in communication between the police, the emergency services, and the medical staff. It seems the police charge, the motorway trespass, was treated separately from the obvious mental crisis.
It seems so. And while in police custody before her court appearance, she remained outwardly relaxed, but gave an absolutely unsettling premonition while being processed.
This quote is essential for understanding her escalating internal disturbance. She told an officer, "We say in Sweden that an accident rarely comes alone. Usually, at least one more follows, maybe 2.
That quote, coming from someone who had just survived 2 collisions, should have been a screaming red flag to anyone processing her. It suggests a clear understanding that the chaos was not over, even if she seemed superficially calm.
And that calmness, often seen after an acute psychotic episode, can be highly deceptive. It can lead assessors to believe the danger has passed.
It's a known phenomenon. So on May 19, 2008, only 2 days after the M6 incident, Sabina appeared in court. She pleaded guilty to the charges of motorway trespass and hitting Officer Cope.
And crucially, she was released from court without a full mandatory psychiatric evaluation. She received a sentence of 1 day in custody, which she was deemed to have already served.
The system had processed a profoundly psychotic woman as a minor public nuisance, ignoring the manifest medical emergency she had caused.
Her release was an administrative decision based on minor charges, completely overriding the obvious clinical indicators of severe mental illness.
Had the police utilized powers under the Mental Health Act to detain her for assessment, this entire subsequent tragedy would likely have been averted. She literally walked out of court and into the street.
After her release, Sabina began wandering the streets of Stoke-on-Trent, trying to locate Ursula's hospital. She was clearly disoriented, carrying her few possessions in a clear plastic bag and, significantly, wearing her sister's green top.
Which is perhaps an indicator of her psychological attachment to, or identification with, Ursula.
Then, at 7 p.m., the course of the tragedy intersected with profound human kindness. Two local men, 54-year-old Glenn Hollinshead and his friend, Peter Malloy, spotted Sabina on Christchurch Street, Fenton, while walking their dog.
And we need to pause and establish who Glenn Hollinshead was. He was the victim of the subsequent crime.
He was a self-employed welder, but also a qualified paramedic and a former RAF airman. By all accounts from his family and friends, he was a man of deep, instinctive compassion.
Sabina appeared friendly initially. She stroked the dog and asked the men for directions to a hotel or a bed and breakfast.
And Hollinshead, seeing a distressed woman who appeared to be in need of refuge and assistance, took pity on her. In an act of pure compassion that defined his character, he offered to take her back to his house on Duke Street to help her settle down and try to locate her sister.
She accepted. And initially, she relaxed, explaining her distress over her hospitalized twin.
Malloy noted that Sabina was still nervous. He initially assumed she was running from an abusive partner, trying to find a safe place.
But over drinks at the house, her extreme paranoia quickly resurfaced and became impossible to ignore. She was constantly getting up, pacing, and looking out of the window, convinced she was being watched.
The active delusion then manifested clearly when she offered the men cigarettes, only to quickly snatch them away before they could take one,
claiming they might be poisoned. These were clear, persistent signs of active delusion, persecution fears, and a breakdown of trust, even in her seemingly calmer state inside the refuge Hollinshead provided.
Malloy left shortly before midnight, uneasy but safe, while Sabina stayed the night.
The next day, May 20th, 2008, Hollinshead was still actively trying to help her. Around midday, he called his brother about local hospitals to try and locate Ursula. He was focused on solving her problem, unaware of the extreme danger she represented.
The fatal moment occurred that evening, at 7:40 p.m. While a meal was being prepared, Hollinshead left the house briefly, stepping out to ask a neighbor, Frank Booth, for tea bags.
Just 1 minute later, he staggered back out of the house, bleeding profusely.
He told Booth the horrifying, concise words, "She stabbed me," before collapsing and quickly dying from 5 stab wounds, inflicted with a kitchen knife taken from his home.
It is deeply necessary to reflect on the immense tragedy here. Glenn Hollinshead died because of his fundamental goodness. His brother noted he would help anybody.
A former RAF airman and paramedic, simply trying to assist someone he perceived to be in distress, offering shelter and safety. The heartbreaking irony is that the danger was internal, not external, as Sabina believed.
And his alleged last words before he died, "Look after my dog for me," just emphasize his generous nature and immediate concern for others, even in his final moments.
As Booth called the emergency services, Sabina fled the premises. This act of flight confirms that even in her psychotic state, she was aware she had committed an act of violence. She was caught on CCTV running out of the house,
wielding a hammer, which she was periodically hitting herself over the head with.
This sequence confirms the violence against Hollinshead wasn't an isolated, sudden act, but part of an ongoing, acute, psychotic crisis evidenced by her immediate flight and extreme self-harm.
She was a danger to herself and others from the moment she was released. A passing motorist, Joshua Gradage, saw the distressed woman hitting herself and bravely intervened to tackle her and attempt to take the hammer.
During the struggle, Sabina demonstrated further erratic violence. She pulled a roof tile out of her pocket, an incredibly strange item to be carrying, and struck Gradage on the back of the head, stunning him temporarily.
The pursuit finally ended at Heron Cross when Sabina made yet another desperate, suicidal attempt. She jumped 12 meters or 40 feet from a bridge onto the busy A50 trunk road below.
She sustained severe, life-threatening injuries, including fractured ankles and a fractured skull, which finally stopped her violent rampage and ensured her detention.
Sabina was arrested while recovering at University Hospital of North Staffordshire on June 6, 2008. She was eventually discharged in a wheelchair on September 11, 2008, and formally charged with murder the same day.
And Ursula, in the meantime, had been released from the hospital in September 2008, having recovered sufficiently from her crushing leg injuries.
Yes, she relocated back to Sweden and then later to the U.S. Crucially, the separation, physical recovery, and removal from the trigger environment likely contributed to the stabilization of both women.
The legal proceedings for Sabina were notably delayed in 2009 due to difficulties obtaining her complete medical records from Sweden.
A necessary and lengthy bureaucratic step required to understand the full context of her underlying mental state and any psychiatric history.
When the trial finally commenced, Sabina pleaded guilty not to murder, but to manslaughter with diminished responsibility on September 2, 2009.
She admitted to stabbing Hollinshead 5 times with a kitchen knife. Throughout extensive police questioning and the trial regarding her actions, she offered no comment, indicating either a genuine lack of recall or an inability to articulate the internal mechanisms that drove her.
The focus of the case then shifted entirely and legally to her mental state at the time of the killing.
Right. And both the prosecution and the defense agreed that Sabina was legally insane at the moment of the killing, but, significantly, had become sane again by the time of the trial, a recovery directly linked to her physical separation from Ursula and treatment.
And this is where that rare psychiatric diagnosis becomes central. We really need to clarify what these terms mean for you. The defense argued she was a secondary sufferer of folie à deux.
Meaning shared psychosis. She was viewed as having been heavily influenced by the presence or perceived presence of her identical twin sister Ursula, who was deemed the primary sufferer, the individual whose initial inherent predisposition triggered the delusion.
So for the listener, what does it mean to be a secondary sufferer in folie à deux? Does the psychosis just vanish immediately when the primary sufferer is removed?
That is the defining mechanism of the disorder, and it's why it was such a strong legal defense here. In classic folie à deux, the secondary patient has usually adopted the delusions of the primary patient, often someone they are closely related to and socially isolated with, like a spouse, a sibling, or, critically, an identical twin.
And when the secondary patient is separated from the primary,
Their delusions often resolve relatively quickly, sometimes requiring only minimal antipsychotic medication because the source of the shared reality has been removed. Sabina's recovery upon separation lent strong credence to this diagnosis.
and the shared genetic makeup of identical twins further complicates this, as our sources note. It suggests an increased vulnerability or a shared predisposition for synchronized psychiatric disorders.
Alternative theories were also cited in court, emphasizing the complexity of diagnosis in an acute crisis. One was acute polymorphic delusional disorder, a condition characterized by rapidly changing delusions and hallucinations, often triggered by extreme stress.
Which the M6 incident and subsequent events certainly fit.
They do, but folie à deux provided the strongest explanation for the shared and synchronized suicidal actions we saw on camera. Regardless of the exact label, the crucial agreement was that mental illness, not malicious criminal intent, was the driver of the violence.
Let's focus on the legal finding of manslaughter with diminished responsibility. For anyone who may not be familiar with UK law, how exactly does diminished responsibility legally protect someone in a case like this? And how does it differ from a full insanity plea?
That's a crucial distinction. Under UK law, specifically the Homicide Act 1957, diminished responsibility is a special defense to murder. Unlike a full insanity plea, which might result in mandatory indefinite detention in a secure hospital, diminished responsibility accepts that the defendant committed the physical act of killing.
But Hutran argues that their capacity to understand their actions, form intent, or exercise self-control was substantially impaired.
Exactly. Impaired by a recognized medical condition, in this case, psychosis. If successful, the charge is reduced from murder, which carries a mandatory life sentence, to manslaughter, allowing the judge flexibility in sentencing. It prioritizes rehabilitation and risk management over strict punishment.
And Justice Saunders ultimately accepted this plea. Sabina was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The judge concluded that the reason for the killing was mental illness, and therefore Sabina had a low level of culpability.
That low culpability finding is tied directly back to the medical evidence. The judge was saying Sabina was not choosing to be wicked, she was obeying delusions. The defense successfully argued that the psychosis was sudden and irresistible.
The judge specifically addressed the inevitable public reaction to the short sentence. Understanding this would generate enormous controversy and pain for the victim's family. He stated, and this is a direct quote from Justice Saunders, "I understand that this sentence will seem entirely inadequate to the relatives of the deceased."
He continued, however, I have sentenced on the basis that the reason for the killing was the mental illness, and therefore the culpability of the defendant is low. It is not designed to reflect the grief the relatives have suffered or to measure the value of Mr. Hollinshead's life. No sentence that I could pass could do that.
That quote frames the legal constraint perfectly. The court was not valuing Glenn Hollinshead's life. They were legally assessing Sabina's criminal intent, which they found to be profoundly compromised by disease.
Yes. The judge stressed that Sabina was suffering from delusions, which she believed to be true, and they dictated her behavior. It is not one of those cases where the defendant could have done something to avoid the onset. The sentence was therefore designed to protect the public and reflect her diminished mental capacity, rather than punishing premeditation.
Sabina served her time at Bronzefield Women's Prison. She was released on parole in 2011, having already spent 439 days in custody before sentencing, and she subsequently returned to Sweden.
The legal system, having determined her illness was resolved and her risk manageable, released her, prioritizing rehabilitation over extended punitive detention.
This brings us to the most painful and critical part of this deep dive. The systemic failure that allowed a deeply disturbed individual, having just exhibited such acute public violence, to be released and commit murder against a man who was simply trying to help.
The systemic criticism was swift and sharp, and rightfully so. Glenn Hollinshead's brother, Gary Hollinshead, and his friend, Peter Malloy, publicly criticized the entire criminal justice system for its handling of the case. They argued vehemently that the murder was entirely preventable.
Gary Hollinshead's statement about culpability is incredibly poignant and nuanced, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of the medical situation while condemning the state.
He said, "We don't hold her responsible, the same as we wouldn't blame a rabid dog for biting someone. She is ill and to a large degree not responsible for her actions. But her mental disorder should have been recognized much earlier."
That analogy is powerful. It confirms the family accepted the role of mental illness. She wasn't a monster, she was sick. But Gary explicitly questioned why her mental condition wasn't properly assessed after the M6 incident.
And after the police's firsthand experiences with her bizarre, violent, and self-destructive behavior, he felt her mental disorder should have been picked up prior to her being let out into the community, possibly saving his brother's life.
And this is where we need to return to the crucial details of the M6 motorway incident. Why did the police decision at the roadside, and subsequently the court decision, override the obvious need for a mental health hold?
Well, we must consider the immense pressure on the emergency services at the roadside. They had two critically injured women who had just been hit by lorries. The priority shifted immediately to life-saving medical care.
But the police were present. They had witnessed the clear psychotic break, the verbal delusions, the physical violence against an officer.
And under the UK Mental Health Act, police have powers to detain a person immediately if they believe they are suffering from a mental disorder and are in need of immediate care or control or pose a risk to themselves or others.
And a critical piece of evidence, which only surfaced publicly much later when the motorway cops footage was heavily scrutinized, confirms this possibility was actively discussed on the M6.
Yes, footage edited from the episode and uploaded online in 2012 showed officers at the roadside discussing detaining and assessing Sabina on mental health grounds, a step that was ultimately not taken. She was taken into standard police custody for the criminal charges instead.
This discussion among the officers constitutes a direct, documented missed opportunity. That single decision to not formally invoke a psychiatric hold but instead process her on minor criminal charges may have directly prevented Hollinshead's murder hours later.
It highlights the vast difference between judging someone as harmless as they did at Kiel and conducting a legally mandated psychiatric hold after an undeniable psychotic episode.
The result was the profound unfairness of Glenn Hollinshead's death. He was described as someone who was just trying to help, who would help anybody. His generosity, his inclination to offer refuge to a person he perceived to be in distress, cost him his life.
His death was a direct, devastating consequence of a systemic failure to recognize, diagnose, and contain a severe acute mental health crisis. It underscores the responsibility placed on the state to protect the public from individuals who are, through no fault of their own, temporarily rendered gravely dangerous by disease.
The current status, based on our sources, provides an uneasy sense of closure to the legal timeline, though not to the ethical questions. Sabina was released on parole in 2011 and returned to Sweden.
And Ursula, after recovering from her injuries, is noted to be living uneventfully in Bellevue, Washington, in the U.S. The separation proved effective in resolving the shared delusion.
This deep dive really reveals the catastrophic path initiated by a highly rare psychiatric condition, folie.
We saw how the shared delusion drove two individuals to extreme, synchronized suicidal behaviors on the motorway, an event documented by sheer chance. But ultimately, the greatest tragedy occurred when the secondary sufferer, Sabina, stabilized just enough to be processed as a minor offender and was released back into the community without the necessary mandatory psychiatric evaluation.
We've charted the rapid and frightening onset of this shared delusion, the physical manifestation of the mental break on the M6, and the critical, documented failure of institutional checks that led directly to the death of Glenn Hollinshead. a man defined by his kindness.
The case serves as a chilling illustration of the fine line between eccentric behavior and acute medical emergency, and the immense responsibility placed on emergency responders and the courts to distinguish between the two, particularly when public safety is at immediate risk.
So considering the severity of the twins' behavior on the M6, the high-speed collision attempts, the violence against police, the profound delusions, what standard of mental health intervention should be required when an individual exhibits public behavior so immediately dangerous to both themselves and others, especially before being released?
It is a complex question of public safety versus individual liberty, especially when that liberty is fundamentally compromised by disease.
The evidence here suggests that the threshold for intervention was set too high, prioritizing a minor criminal charge over a life-threatening documented psychotic break. We encourage you to consider the intersection of mental health law and true crime in contexts like this, reflecting on the institutional processes that protect us, and how fragile those protections can be when faced with truly rare and explosive human pathology.